Alright, let's keep going with protist energy. So protists can get energy in all sorts of ways. Some of them are autotrophs that are doing photosynthesis, and this is actually an algae that when I bring in samples, usually for the lab, I go to Malibu Creek and I just scoop up a bunch of algae. And a lot of it is this type, which is called Spirogyra, and it has kind of an interesting sort of spiraling arrangement for its chloroplasts, almost kind of like the candy cane type striping in a way. And again, it's called Spirogyra. It's kind of a famous type of algae. And then some are heterotrophs and do respiration, just like our cells do. And this is an amoeba that's reaching out to capture a smaller protist, excuse me, which looks kind of like a paramecium to me. And if you remember, we've learned this and talked about it a few times. This would represent phagocytosis. All right, the video that you're going to watch actually talks about these really quickly in the video, so you'll learn about these. And very few times in our lab have students found these, but some have found them. And one of the ways we can tell people have found a euglena is with this red spot right here, which the movie will talk about. So these are kind of unique because they kind of have both algae and protozoan characteristics, meaning they can do photosynthesis, but they can also hunt. So they're like a predator that can also do photosynthesis. So that's kind of special. And in the video, they talk about how scientists think they split off from the rest of the protists a long time ago and are pretty unique. And so let's talk about it a little bit more. So this spot here is actually sometimes called an eye spot, and it's close to the flagella, which you can see here. The flagella is coming in, and based on how close it is to the flagella, which is coming in right here, it probably controls the flagella, and it's sensitive to light, and kind of like an eye would be, but we don't think they have like vision, but more they can sense where the sunlight is, so they can move the flagella in such a way as to go towards the sunlight. So maybe as the sun is going down, or if they're under shade for a long time from some tree or something, they can swim and move to where the light is, which is much more advanced than most protists are, and that's part of why scientists kind of put them in their sort of special category. But they are generally, I think, clumped in with the algae normally, and so they will show that in the video and talk about that. All right, so protist evolution, we would not exist without the stuff I'm about to go over right now, because without protist evolution, there would be no plants, animals, and fungus that evolved, because they evolved the first nucleus, and we have a nucleus. So our own evolution actually goes back, way, way, way back to protist evolution, because all animals and plants and fungus have protist ancestors, which we learned at the start of Unit 4 when we made cladograms. So let me fix my timer here, which, oops, I forgot to start. Anyways, so let's take a look. So what we're going to go over right now is called the endosymbiosis theory. So endo means inside, and symbiosis means like a relationship. So let's go over it first, and we'll talk about the picture. So what we think happened was bacteria started living inside each other. And when they did this, they helped each other survive, which became a really super critical form of mutualism that led to the evolution of, like I said, plants, animals, and fungus. And so one of the cells, the larger one, we think provided protection and like an environment for the other one to live in, and the other cell was making energy for it. And this is believed to be the evolution of mitochondria and chloroplasts. So that means that the mitochondria inside all your cells that makes energy has its own bacteria ancestor, which is really weird, and there's proof of that, which we're going to get into. So it's weird to think that something inside your cells has its own ancestors. So what we see down here, we have the purple one. These colors should have been reversed, because the green one, it would make more sense, was doing photosynthesis. But anyways, so ignore the colors a little bit. But basically the smaller one went inside the bigger one, and it is believed this bigger one would normally sort of eat or consume smaller ones, but something happened in evolution where instead of destroying it for nutrients, it kept it alive. And it basically, probably the bacteria somehow sensed that it was getting energy anyway, and it didn't need to destroy the other bacteria because the other bacteria was most likely doing photosynthesis and maybe respiration, and the energy was available anyway. So the bacteria, in its own weird way, had the intelligence to not destroy this smaller one and instead use it. And we're going to talk about some modern examples of that exist today. And that's why it's mutualism, because they're helping each other. And then over time, they basically became kind of like a unified structure where when they reproduced, the new ones also had the structure inside that were making energy for it. So here's a little diagram that kind of walks us through. I want to jump ahead. Yeah, let's just do this one. This happened about 1.5 billion years ago. I think the video might say 2 billion years ago. But I think normally they think 1.5. So what we have here is aerobic bacteria. So these are not doing photosynthesis. They're doing respiration, and they started living inside. They think this happened first, that they started living inside larger bacteria, and the bacteria kept it alive and used it to get ATP, which we learned about in Unit 2, and eventually became mitochondria, which is inside our cells. So this drawing over here would represent the ancestors of all the mitochondria, which you probably have quadrillions, certainly hundreds of trillions, but probably quadrillions of mitochondria in your body. And they would all have their own ancestor back to these guys. And then eventually they started absorbing photosynthetic bacteria also and using them to make carbohydrates. And the ancestors, they became the ancestors, if we follow the diagram, of plants and plant-like protists, where these ones became the ancestors of animals like us, fungus, and non-plant-like protists. All right, let's go over the evidence for this. And the evidence is, the main form of evidence comes from the fact that mitochondria and chloroplasts both have their own DNA and have their own ribosomes. So normally we only see those two things within cells that are their own living things. So why would something inside a cell have DNA and ribosomes unless way back in time they were actually their own organisms? And in this diagram, we've looked at diagrams of mitochondria before, but none of the diagrams I showed you early in the year had DNA labeled, which you see right here, and ribosomes labeled. So this diagram was kind of hard to find because usually they don't label those. And another thing that is used as evidence is mitochondria and chloroplasts can reproduce like bacteria by doing binary fission, which is shown in this diagram. And so, for instance, when you exercise, part of getting in shape or becoming more fit or whatever, and just getting less tired when you work out is kind of what I mean. As far as your energy, is because when you start straining your muscles, the mitochondria in your muscles start to go through binary fission to compensate for that stress and strain, and thus that's part of getting in shape, is actually causing your mitochondria to do binary fission so you can now make more energy and ATP for your cells. And then finally we have some modern examples of endosymbiosis. So for instance, some amoeba have figured out that instead of destroying bacteria they capture, they actually keep them alive inside themselves and use them to make energy. So it's basically the same exact concept, except instead of it being a bacteria and a bacteria, it's an amoeba and a bacteria. And also even animals are doing this. Simple animals like coral and hydra, which are shown down, here's a hydra, will capture algae, and they can eat them and destroy them and digest them, but instead they keep them alive so they can make energy for them and get the carbohydrates. And that's why this hydra is so green, because it has chlorella, which is an algae inside of it. And as we've talked about with the coral reefs, I'm going to kind of sidebar. I'm going to tell two additional little stories here, and then I'll stop this video. You learned about coral reefs in Unit 5 and how they're dying. And part of why they're dying is these symbiotic algae are actually what's dying, and that's causing the coral to die. So that's how dependent they are on this algae that lives inside them. Is they, in the video, talked about global warming. Even a 2-degree increase in the ocean is causing this algae to die, which is not good for a lot of reasons. Like they're a big part of the food web. They're creating, as you learned in Unit 5, half the oxygen on Earth is made by this algae. But then also the coral, it's dying within the coral from this temperature increase, which causes the coral to die, and usually the term for that is bleaching, where it turns white, it turns pale, the algae, or the coral. And then another story I think is important to tell, and I think this is a really important, just a historical story, is this concept was figured out by a woman named, I'm pretty sure her name was Lynn Margulis, and I think it's an important story to tell as far as the history of science. And she figured the endosymbiosis theory out at a time where women biologists were not really doing very much, and it was a male-dominated field. Science was for centuries male-dominated field, and women were fighting for equality in a lot of different industries. I think she figured out in the 60s, which is right around when women were really fighting for more equality in the workplace and in the field of science, for instance. And she figured it out, and the main thing she figured out was right here, was this slide. She figured out they had DNA and ribosomes, which is extremely strong. I mean, that's almost automatically enough to prove that they used to be their own organisms. And a lot of the male scientists in the biology field were threatened by the fact that she figured it out before they did, and a lot of male biologists were trying to say she was wrong and trying to disprove her. And I guess there was actually publicity around this where they were even publicly saying, no way did she figure this out. And then eventually, one of the things that's great about science is people try to prove each other wrong, and it usually results in somebody being right. And they tried to prove her wrong, and they couldn't. And then eventually they backed off, and other scientists, men and women, were agreeing with her, and these kind of more, I don't know, mean or bigoted scientists in biology had to back off, and it probably made them look pretty bad and showed that they were sort of sexist in the way they looked at scientists. And so this was kind of a big moment in biology because this woman had proven something pretty meaningful and really kind of exposed some of the discrimination that women were going through in biology. So that's always a story I tell in class, and just think it's important to understand that everyone can make amazing discoveries in biology, and we should not discriminate. All right, I'm going to stop there because I didn't set my timer, and I have no